The year 1876 marked a pivotal moment in the history of the American frontier as the Great Sioux War intensified. Running Wolf, an Arikara scout, along with a group of brave companions, embarked on a journey that would test their resilience and loyalty. From their enlistment at Fort Lincoln to the arduous march across the plains, their mission carried them through harsh conditions, encounters with fellow scouts, and a series of dramatic events that would ultimately intertwine their fates with the legendary Battle of the Little Bighorn. This journey not only highlights the crucial role of scouts, but also reveals the deep personal sacrifices made by those on the front lines of American history. In the spring of 1876, Running Wolf enlisted at Fort Lincoln with 6 companions: Young Hawk, Horns in Front, Tall Bear, Foolish Bear, Red Foolish Bear, and Charging Bull. They departed from Fort Berthold, spending the night at Fort Stevenson, where Big John, an Arikara scout, oversaw their group. The same individual had previously held command at Fort Stevenson. The following day, they camped north of what is now Washburn, before reaching Bismarck by noon, where they crossed the river aboard a steamboat. The next day, Girard informed them to prepare for the parade, during which they would march in Indian style, singing their traditional songs. This marked the beginning of the first day of the march. The songs performed on that occasion were some of the same melodies later shared during the council at Bear's Belly. After the parade, the scouts led the procession, with Custer at the forefront and the white cavalry following at the rear. The scouts were under the leadership of Varnum, also known as Peaked Face, who camped near the scouts with a single orderly and a cook preparing his meals in his personal tent. The army made camp at noon and stayed there until the next morning. The following day, as they stopped for dinner, rain began to fall, halting their progress for the rest of the day. The next morning, the march resumed, and the army established a second camp on a broad, flat area to the west and north of the Heart River. On the third day, the army continued without a dinner stop, and the scouts referred to their next location as Camp Number 3, also called Turkey Buzzard Camp. That evening, 2 scouts, One Horn and Red Foolish Bear, were sent back with mail. The soldiers had been paid at the first camp, and a herd of cattle accompanied the army to provide provisions. They ate dinner at Big Mountain, Butte, and set up Camp Number 4 in a wide valley. The next day, dinner was on the open prairie, and Camp Number 5 was established at the present-day site of Hebron. The following day, rain interrupted their journey during the dinner stop, and the army camped near Young Man's Butte, calling it Camp Number 6. The next day's dinner stop was on a muddy flat, where heavy roads forced them to halt for the night at Camp Number 7, beyond Young Man's Butte. They ate dinner the next day in a coulee east of what is now Dickinson, setting up Camp Number 8. That night, Red Foolish Bear returned to camp and reported to Bobtailed Bull that Red Bear had fallen behind with an exhausted horse. Bobtailed Bull led a party back to retrieve Red Bear, bringing him to camp by morning, where Strikes 2 lent him a spare horse. That day's dinner stop was in a wooded coulee, and due to muddy conditions, the army stayed there, naming it Camp Number 9. By noon the next day, they reached the Badlands and established Camp Number 10. Custer went ahead to scout a route for the wagons. The following day, the army entered the Badlands, setting up Camp Number 11 just inside. Timber was cut and carried to use for bridge building. Orders were issued for each man to carry his own dinner the next day. Camp Number 12 was established in the Little Missouri Valley near Soldier Butte. After passing Soldier Butte, they camped just beyond at Camp Number 13, where snow fell during the night, accumulating 2 to 3 feet on the ground. The army remained in place throughout the day and into the following night. By the next day, much of the snow had melted, allowing them to continue their journey through thick mud and slush. The conditions were challenging for the teams as they traveled along a flat-topped ridge. Around midday, at the ridge's end, they encountered Crow Bear, a Groventris scout on horseback, who had arrived from Powder River with the mail. After a brief stop for dinner, Crow Bear turned back, though the army did not pause for their own midday meal that day. They descended a coulee to Beaver Creek and established Camp No. 14. The following day, they followed Beaver Creek to its terminus, where they set up Camp No. 15. The subsequent march took them across an open prairie, a flat expanse of land where distant blue hills were visible. Camp No. 16 was established on this prairie. The next day, the army advanced toward the Blue Hills, arriving at a coulee lined with cottonwoods, which the Dakota Scouts identified as Cottonwood Creek. This became Camp No. 17. By midday, they reached the foothills, and after another meal, they continued their progress to the point where Powder River meets the Badlands, where they set up Camp No. 18. At dawn, Custer approached Varnum's tent and called for Bob-tailed Bull. He instructed Bob-tailed Bull to select 7 scouts to move ahead and search for signs of the Dakota. These scouts included 4 Dakota and 3 Arikara. The Arikara chosen were Young Hawk, Forked Horn, and One Feather, while the Dakota scouts were Karu, Matok Shah, Buffalo Body, Pita A8, and White Cloud. A group of white soldiers also joined, forming 2 lines as they marched. Their orders were clear: not to return until they found recent evidence of the Dakotas and to report their findings at the base camp near the mouth of the Powder River. Camp No. 19 was established at the mouth of the Powder River, where a steamboat was stationed. 2 scouts, Horns in front, and Charata, Wolf, who were unwell, remained there under the care of Tall Bear. A store tent managed by a white man was also at this location, and soldiers purchased hindquarters of deer from him for $4 apiece. The wagons were left under the protection of a guard while the army advanced toward Tongue River, eventually setting up Camp No. 20 about 2.5 miles from its mouth. At this site, the scouts sent back their initial report to Custer. The journey continued as they crossed the Tongue River to a plateau where Camp No. 21 was located. The next day they moved to a flat-topped elevation far from the Rosebud and about a mile from the Elk River, marking Camp No. 22. Camp No. 23 was situated on high ground approximately a quarter-mile above the mouth of the Rosebud River, and Camp No. 24 was established on a flat area at the Rosebud's mouth. One morning, Custer and his brother Tom visited the scout camp to speak with Soldier, Bob-tailed Bull, and Bloody Knife, with Gerard serving as interpreter. During their visit, Young Hawk reported discovering a fresh Dakota trail and campsite along the river. Meanwhile, a steamboat was unloading boxes of hardtack crackers, which the men quickly gathered into their leather saddlebags when the bugle sounded. As this unfolded, Custer prepared dispatches, assigning 6 scouts to deliver them to the base camp at the Powder River's mouth. The chosen scouts were Foolish Angry Bear, in charge, Running Wolf, Howling Wolf, Curly Head, Goose, and Young Hawk. However, Custer later withheld Young Hawk and Goose from the mission, knowing their skill in tracking and fighting Dakotas. He recalled their capabilities from the Black Hills expedition. The remaining 4 scouts received their orders to stay at the base camp after delivering the dispatches. Setting out at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the scouts traveled through the night, paused for breakfast, and continued until sunrise, when they sighted the base camp's wagons a 1.5 miles away. Charging up the hill and wagon, 2 Arikara scouts left behind at Fort Lincoln rode out to meet them, and they conversed before heading to the base camp. By noon, the 6 scouts were promptly assigned to carry new dispatches from Fort Lincoln back to Custer, accompanied by a white soldier. Running Wolf led this group of scouts, which included Howling Wolf, Horns in front, Tall Bear, Charging up the hill, and Curly Head. After finishing their meal, they resumed their journey, riding until midnight. Exhausted, they stopped to camp and rest. The next morning, they continued traveling and reached a campsite near the Rosebud River at nightfall. The following day, they arrived at the mouth of the Rosebud, where supplies were being unloaded. From a distance, they spotted people, assumed they were Dakotas, and quickly turned into the timber along the Rosebud for cover. They stayed hidden until sunset, at which point Tall Bear suggested returning to the base camp. However, a soldier, using gestures and a few Dakota words, insisted they could not return. He instructed them to deliver dispatches to Custer, proposing they cross the Rosebud under the cover of darkness to avoid the presumed Dakotas and continue their mission. Following his advice, they forded the river, the water reaching their armpits, and traveled through the night. By the next afternoon, around 4 o'clock, they spotted a soldiers' camp at the mouth of the Big Horn. They believed they were following Custer's trail but were unsure due to the darkness and their fear of the Dakotas near the Rosebud. In reality, those they had seen were Strikes 2's group, retreating to the base camp after the Little Bighorn battle. This group of scouts had hurriedly passed others assigned to move the horses during the night, aiming to avoid the Dakotas. Upon arriving at the Bighorn camp, the scouts learned about the events of the Custer fight. General Terry, referred to by the Arikara as "man wearing the bear robe," or bear coat, due to a bearskin coat he had once worn, was in command at this camp. Although Running Wolf did not know who initially shared the news, all the scouts learned about the battle. The steamboat had traveled a short distance up the Bighorn River, as far as the water's depth allowed, reportedly to transport the wounded and survivors from Custer's command. This information reached them around noon. Later, 2 scouts, Crow Bear and a white soldier, arrived from the base camp, bringing news of Strikes 2's group. They reported the devastating defeat, saying, "All of the white soldiers and some of the scouts were killed." Crow Bear then added, "The scouts who were killed included Bloody Knife, Bobtailed Bull, Little Brave, Forked Horn, Red Foolish Bear, Young Hawk, and Goose." These men were not part of the 2 groups that managed to retreat to the base camp. Crow Bear and a white soldier were immediately dispatched back to the base camp with messages. Later, Terry arrived at the scout camp, gave Running Wolf a pair of field glasses, and instructed him to head up the Bighorn to the hills to watch for the returning steamboat. Running Wolf, accompanied by Charging Up the Hill, set off to carry out this task. That night they returned and reported that no boat was in sight. The next morning, Terry visited the camp again and repeated the instructions, this time handing Running Wolf his own field glasses. Terry also directed Howling Wolf to join the effort to check for the steamboat's approach. After scouting, the 2 returned for lunch, and Running Wolf returned the glasses to Terry. Then, around 3 or 4 p.m., the sharp sound of a whistle echoed from upstream, signaling the steamboat's arrival. The scouts gathered on the riverbank and saw the boat approaching, its deck covered with a white canvas under which wounded soldiers rested in the shade. On the prow of the steamboat they spotted Strikes the Enemy, the injured Crow scout. The soldiers began unloading the wounded, laying them on canvas sheets spread across the riverbank. As the task neared completion, Running Wolf spotted Goose near the engine room, a blanket draped over his shoulders, and his hand injured, wrapped up against his chest. He approached him with another scout and assisted him up the bank. Goose spoke to him, saying, "We fought with the Sioux, surrounded by them in the timber, but we managed to escape. The other scouts are following the boat on foot." Soon after, the white survivors arrived, and finally the 4 scouts, Young Hawk, Red Foolish Bear, Forked Horn, and a Crow scout, Half Yellow Face. Upon arriving, Young Hawk began recounting the battle. "Bloody Knife is dead," he said. "Bobtailed Bull is dead, and Little Brave is dead. We couldn't find Little Brave's body, but we found the others, their heads crushed and destroyed." Young Hawk was leading Little Brave's spotted pinto. He then shared his own account of the battle in the timber and the events that followed once he reached the camp in the ravine. The next morning they loaded the wounded soldiers, along with Goose, back onto the boat and continued down the river. Terry and the chief with a red nose were in charge. They instructed all the scouts to follow the east bank of the Yellowstone, Elk River, looking for any Dakota crossing to the west. The scouts were gone for 10 days, with Forked Horn, Horns in front, Red Foolish Bear, Charging Up the Hill, Tall Bear, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Wagon in the party. 2 scouts, Curly Head and Howling Wolf, remained behind at Terry's camp. They searched for the Dakota Trail across the river for 10 days, only to return to find that Soldier had left. The camp had moved to the mouth of the Rosebud, along with the base camp at Powder River, forming one unified base. The commanders decided to head up the Rosebud in search of Sitting Bull. Halfway up the Rosebud, they encountered Crook, leading a group of foot soldiers and mounted scouts, possibly Arapaho or Shoshone. All the scouts, Terry, the chief with a red nose, Varnum, Crook, and their men, came together. They followed the Dakota Trail to the Tongue River, where they set up camp. The following day they moved on to the Powder River, where large timber lined the banks, and set up camp. The next morning, the surviving soldiers from Custer's command, all the Arikara scouts, and Crook's Indian scouts marched under the direction of Terry and Varnum to the mouth of Powder River, where they established their camp. Crook's command, along with the rest of the soldiers, remained at this location. At the mouth of the Powder River, the Crow scouts and Crook scouts departed to return to their reservations. The rest of the camp then made their way back to Crook's camp on the Rosebud, only to find that Crook had already moved along the Dakota Trail. The chief with a red nose, accompanied by other officers, arrived at the scouts' camp with a letter in hand. He selected 7 scouts to carry the letter to Crook, while the remaining members of the camp were instructed to return to the base camp. The 7 scouts chosen were Soldier, Black Fox, Charging Up the Hill, Boy Chief, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Carew, Dakota. They successfully delivered the letter to Crook's camp, only to learn that Crook was following Sitting Bull's trail. Crook informed them that they were to stay and continue scouting for him, reporting back every other day. The scouts obeyed these orders under Crook's command. Upon reaching Beaver Creek, Running Wolf and Young Hawk, who had been hunting on a ridge, met up with the rest of the scouts. They also encountered a party of Indians on foot, as well as cavalry under a different commander. Carew, who had been sent back to Powder River with the mail, returned shortly after with a new set of orders from Beaver Creek. He was no longer to carry the mail, but instead, Soldier, Boy Chief, Black Fox, and Charging Up the Hill were to go in his place. As the sun set, the remaining 3 scouts set up camp, the last of the original scouting party. Their rations consisted of 2 crackers each, along with 2 spoonfuls of coffee and sugar. As they were about to rest around midnight, they heard the sound of approaching horses. The Dakotas arrived riding on horseback, soon beginning to fire upon the camp. The soldiers, still groggy and half asleep, scrambled out of their tents, sometimes without weapons or any means of defense. The command was to retreat to a ridge of higher ground. As the Dakotas circled and fired into the camp, the soldiers responded, lighting up the area with gunfire. The cavalry initially stayed out of the fight, but eventually the bugle sounded, lanterns were lit, and they saddled up to join the fray. The Dakotas, after some time, withdrew into the darkness. The scouts, positioned on a small hill, did not engage in the battle. The next day the soldiers stopped pursuing the Dakota Trail and made camp at Soldier Butte. They then reached the Little Missouri and discovered an old Dakota camp where they settled for the night. Around noon, they found another Dakota camp in the timber, but the officer prohibited any engagement, as he intended to remain near the camp and set up at Custer's former campsite east of Rosebud Butte. They reached this location around 5 p.m. As night fell, the scouts noticed an unusual gathering of men in the cavalry camp, which struck them as odd. Carew approached to find out what was happening among the soldiers, with Young Hawk following him. Calling out to Running Wolf by name, he said, "These men are preparing letters to be sent back to Fort Lincoln, and we are to deliver them tonight." After having supper, they departed at sunset, carrying the letters destined for Fort Lincoln. They rode throughout the night, stopping the next morning to eat and tend to their horses at Young Man's Butte. They continued their journey all day, reaching Sentinel Butte as night fell. They traveled through the night and the following day, finally arriving at Fort Lincoln just before dark. Running Wolf was officially discharged in January 1877. As the scouts' journey came to an end, marked by their grueling ride back to Fort Lincoln, the impact of their mission was unmistakable. Though they were far from the battlefield, their courage, commitment, and endurance were integral to the unfolding story of the American West. Running Wolf's discharge in January 1877 signaled the close of a chapter in the lives of those who had faced both the physical and emotional challenges of war. Their story, woven into the larger tapestry of the Sioux conflict, serves as a reminder of the unsung heroes whose contributions helped shape the outcome of one of the most defining moments in American history.